Hello everyone and welcome to this week's edition of A Slice of History with the Butterfly Princess. This week I'm reading you an article from the March 2025 edition of the BBC History magazine. Now this is a conversation between a panel of three women historians, and these women are discussing the importance of telling women's stories throughout history. And this article has been published in the March 2025 edition of the BBC History magazine. So these three women historians who are on this panel are Sarah Richardson. Now she's a professor of modern British history at the University of Glasgow and chair of the Women's History Network. Hannah Cusworth. She is a creational fellow at Queen's House as part of Royal Museums Greenwich, and is a doctoral student with English heritage. And the third historian is Hannah Scholder. Now she's a lecturer, is a fellow and tutor in medieval history at St John's College at the University of Oxford. So here goes. So here's the first question, and then I'm going to read you the questions and then what the answers for the panel of the three women historians gave. So first question is, before we get into some of the thornier elements of the study of women's history, let's talk about some of its achievements. What stories have been made over the past few years? So the first answer, this is Sarah Richardson's answer. The relationship between women's history and other types of history has really come to the fore in recent years. There's been fascinating work going on into the role of women as activists, for instance, and connecting the study of women and of disability in past centuries. So I think we've been moving away from the traditional approach of looking at individuals to consider the interactions between different areas of history. Hannah Cusworth. My area is mainly black British history, in which there have been a renowned focus on the individual, particularly on black women whose stories we have known about for a little while, but which are now in the spotlight thanks to novels, films, and television series. Following the focus on Queen Charlotte in Richardson, for instance, there's been an explosion of interest in women of colour in 18th century Britain. I recently asked a group of fellow historians about the trends they had spotted, and someone mentioned that there had been two novels about Queen Victoria's ward and Forbes be published in the past year or so alone. So it would be nice to move away from the individual stories of great women, but I think that sometimes telling those kind of stories has to happen first in order to lay the groundwork for other types of history. This is Hannah Scholder's answer. I'm a medievalist, and women's history is really thriving in medieval studies at the moment, as evidenced by the massive medieval women exhibition, which was held at the British Library that ran until the 2nd of March 2025. There has been a tendency in the past to focus on aristocratic individuals. Figures such as Eleanor of Aquitaine are very cool, but their stories have sometimes obscured the wealth of material on other women in the Middle Ages. There are now more attempts to look carefully through the archives for evidence of women's experiences right across the social spectrum. There has been fascinating research into unpaid domestic work and acts of care that often go unrecognised, but without without which society may have collapsed, for instance. Next question. Are there any aspects of women's lives in the past that continue to be overlooked? Hannah Skolder's answer. One specific area of the Middle Ages that I think needs a lot more work is late medieval slavery, which is very understudied, a glorious period, understudied. People unstudied. People think of the Renaissance as being a glorious period, but it was underpinned by slavery. Most of the enslaved were women. So there is a whole cahoot of generally young women whose histories have not been uncovered and that really deserve to be written. Sarah Richardson's answer. I think the voices of marginalised women are neglected, mainly because of the difficulties in finding sources that detail their lives. And it's certainly the case that elite and literate women tend to grab the lion's share of the research, perhaps understandably because they were the women who left the record. But people have also got a lot more creative in finding these stories. There's a great project going on at the moment called Voices of Women in Early Modern Ireland. If you want to find out more about this project, you can go to voiceproject.ie, for instance, which is using AI to recover the lives of women from a whole host of digested records. That kind of technology offers huge potential to explore archives that might not on the face of it look that promising. And the Cusworth's answer. There has been so much great work in my field around the experiences of Black and enslaved women, but one area that I think is due more attention is the white woman, and particularly the women in Britain who were involved in building the British Empire in a variety of ways. It's always been assumed that it was men who benefited from trading the goods of empire, but you can find numerous examples of women who used those goods to enhance their status. I don't think there's been enough attention paid to how the British Empire helped some women forward their careers, furnish their homes and so on. Next question. One idea that has become popular in the past few years is reclaiming women's stories, in some cases, especially presenting them as inspirational and motivational. It's sometimes refined to as the globalisation of history, and is something that I know you're particularly interested. Hannah, what's your take on the phenomenon? First question, answer. I first posted about this on X a while ago, asking if anyone had written about the trend for presenting female figures from history as what we could term girl bosses. But by that I mean strong women who are seen as aspirational in a very individual sense, and often is quite a capitalist sense of their ability to accumulate wealth and power. I had a flood of responses. Many of them, interestingly, came from art historians who pointed to the recovery of female artists who were being presented through the girl boss lens. But I think there's been a real tendency for it in public history more generally, in television shows, in galleries and museums, in heritage spaces, and particularly in children's books. I do understand it, because one of the things that people ask from history is to gain lessons for the future of their own lives. My slight reservation in some instances is what we're doing these women a disservice, taking their complex music lives and presenting them through a narrow lens for our personal taste in 21st century society. In doing so, we can throw away aspects that we feel are a little more inconvenient, whether it's their political views or as is sometimes the case in my area of research, their links to transatlantic slavery and presenting them as these comfortable motivational figures. Hannah Skolder's answer. It's really interesting. It's a really interesting idea, particularly in the context of the Middle Ages. There are a range of women from that period who present amazing models of achievement, agency, and ambition, and some of them were also extremely unpleasant and did some pretty dreadful things. We also need to be really careful that when we think we found a medieval women's amazing success story, we're not underpinning the sheer degree of oppression women felt in that period. There's a really interesting 2024 article in the journal Past and Present by Judith Bennett, who's an American by Judith Bennett, who's an American historian of women in the Middle Ages. She addresses this question head on, writing about late medieval convertry, which is an extraordinary setting in that for every 7 men there were 10 women. The city was dominated by women who had mostly imagined that they're immigrated from the countryside as spinners because it was a big centre of cloth production. In her article, Bennett considers the ways in which these female spinners were a very powerful presence, and in some senses this does feel like a girl power kind of story. But she goes on to look at the ways in which the masters and merchants of Coventry, who felt completely outnumbered, got freaked out and tried to really tighten the constraints on these women. The women, as a result, found themselves being supervised in every aspect and detail of their life. It's a reminder of the sheer levels of constraints and oppression that women often faced, and a really important corrective to the kind of inspirational models which we might sometimes want to look for in history. Sarah Richardson's answer. An obvious example to cite here is the women's suffragette movement in Britain. The Pancras, for instance, have been huge, and understandably so, because without the activism of such individuals, it's unlikely that women would have got the vote. It's true that in the end it was introduced by men and by Parliament, but it's also true that it was the pressure that the more militant suffragettes put on the public that got the message across in a way that hadn't been possible across the previous 40 years of activism. Yet the link some of these women had with the movement and the attitude some had towards the working class are pretty horrific. So on the one hand, there are women who have long been such as seen as inspirational and who had status erected to them. But on the other hand, there's a dark underside that has been neglected until quite recently. Feminist historians sometimes haven't really wanted to expose the nastier side of the suffragette movement. In my own work on gender and political culture, a lot of the really interesting and successful women in politics have been pretty unpleasant people. That might be because of the nature of the political arena. History shows us that in order to make an impact and get the message across, people have often trodden on lots of managerised groups. So the women that we think are successful are often the ones when you scratch the surface may perhaps not be as motivational or heroic as we would like. Next question. You've identified one of the areas in which the girls' boss happens as being the public sphere, and that it can sometimes be difficult to communicate discussions about history in that arena. Do you have any tips for how we might improve the way we do that? Hannah Skolder's answer. One of the most moving historical public events I've ever taken part in was at the Feminist Library in London. It was about 15th century French writer Christine de Pizan, who is in many ways an incredible example of a girl boss kind of figure. She was a widowed single mother with several children who turned to writing in order to support herself and her family. She was an Italian living in France too, so an outsider in lots of ways. She's an amazing individual. But what was great about this particular event was that it wasn't just about putting Christine forward as some kind of role model, because her situation and her circumstances were completely different from those we experience today. Instead, it used Christine's writings as a way to think about responses to domestic abuse in the 21st century, and featured one talk on Christine and another from a social worker who works with present day survivors of domestic abuse. I found it moving and inspiring because it used the consideration of the historical figure to throw critical doubt on the kind of self-narratives of progress that we have and many of the assumptions that we make today. It was very reminiscent and textured without the need to flatter things and say, here's a role model for us in the 21st century. Sarah Richardson's answer. What's important with these individual women from the past is not to think of them in two dimensions. They're often very simple narratives when we look at the histories of some of these very inspirational women. But everyone has some sort of backstory and has strong a variety of experiences, people and resources in order to achieve what they did. So it's about trying to reclaim the hidden histories of these individuals in order to paint a more lucid picture of their lives. Moving on to the challenges facing the study of women's history in 2025. Has the political volatility of recent years made any impact? Hannah Skolder's answer. In many ways, it just makes it all the more pressing. It seems very obvious, right, in this moment, why this matters quite so much. We're really lucky here at the University of Oxford because in 2020, the institution was able to fund a new chair in women's history, the Hilary Rodham Cluton Chair in Women's History. Hannah Cusworth's answer. I agree, it feels really important at this moment to mark the political volatility you mentioned and the really difficult circumstances that a lot of scholars are living through. I was talking recently to a professor in the United States who says that though he is already going into how they might need to rename course titles in light of the purge of DEC, diversity, equality and inclusion initiatives being undertaken by President Trump's new administration. Of course, history will always go on. It's continually being made and definitely exists outside of the academy, but it does feel like there are certain parts of the world, the US, but also Gaza, in which it's all really challenging to be a scholar of women's history, or indeed of anything in this moment in time. Sarah Richardson's answer. From my perspective, the culture war narrative of the past 5 to 10 years in Britain has been difficult for academic historians, and particularly women historians, because it has felt almost as if the work we're doing has been seen as a challenge in some sort of established view of history, but that's what makes it all the more important. What it also communicates is the achievements that can be made in a hostile environment, which is fitting because many women we've studied had to navigate similar environments. So it almost makes it more important that we advertise and promote the tools and resources we've drawn on to work in the face of such hostility. Something else worth considering is the term feminist. Not all women's history is necessarily feminist history, and it doesn't have to be. Yes, it sometimes seems to be the case that feminism is presented as a dirty word, or that all women historians have got a feminist agenda to rip up the comfortable historians people are used to. When I've been interviewed on some radio shows, for example, it's felt as if the suspicion is that you're trying to impose some sort of feminist agenda on the past. But we just need to keep drawing on the history and the author of the sources to stress that while feminism might be a 19th and early 20th century phenomenon that struggles for identity and power was shared by women earlier on in history. So there's a current of ideology and politics that women's historians are continually navigating. Finally, how can we as people charged with communicating history to the public improve the way in which we talk about women's experiences in the past? Hannah Scolder's answer. I'd like to see megalievalists being even more attentive to thinking about women's subjectives. We try to consider all the various ways in which women were constrained and oppressed in the period, but I think we need to continue striving to find ways to write about these women and individuals with profoundly textured experience and diverse ways of responding to those patterns of oppression. We don't just want endless histories of the way in which women were oppressed. We also want the histories of the ways in which these women as individuals responded to that oppression. And we need to find ways to write about women's agency without underestimating the challenges and difficulties they face. A minute. Look up what answer. I'd stress the need for people who maybe don't see themselves as women historians or who are perhaps not telling a story that's particularly focused on women to interrogate women into these stories. And I hope that over time we can push people outside of the discipline to read the work that is incredible scholars are doing, and in turn to initiate the work into the public or academic histories they're making. Sarah Richardson's answer. One of the strengths of the Women's History Network, of which I'm the chair, is that its membership isn't just made up of academics, it also includes members of the public who are interested in all kinds of histories, family historians, members of community groups, family people who work in museums, and so on. This wider community involvement is one of the key things that will help integrate the idea that women's presence is just as normal part of any history. After all, women were half of the population and they contributed economically, politically, socially and culturally. We just need to recognise that, and my hope is that women's history becomes a really communal activity in which everyone can participate, in which everyone has a voice. And that concludes this week's episode of A Slice of History with the Butterfly Princess. I hope you've found this week's episode of A Slice of History with the Butterfly Princess interesting and insightful, and I hope you can join me next week for next week's instalment. But until then, have a lovely rest of your week. Take care, and I will see you very soon. Bye bye for now.